Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you. I'm delighted to introduce Hardeep Anand as our next speaker. Hardeep Anand is Director of One Water Strategy at Miami-Dade County. He focuses on breaking down silos in water management within county government and across jurisdictions. He led the execution of an approximately $7.5 billion multi-year infrastructure program in Miami-Dade County as Deputy Director at Miami-Dade Water and Sewer Department. And this includes implementation of approximately $3 billion state-mandated ocean outfall legislation. He's a transformational executive and thought leader in integrated water resources management with more than 25 years experience in the public and private sectors. And I'm very excited for the audience because I think you will learn a lot from this talk. So thank you very much again, Hardeep. We are really happy to have you here, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Pranoy, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to actually have this conversation every time I have this conversation in a university setting or an extended university setting. I'm always excited about it to bring this practicing side of the work that we do. Now, the talk today that I have is mostly about what we have done in Miami-Dade, but I also will take you beyond Miami-Dade and a little bit of the local issues, national, but also global, and with the intent that hopefully it'll bring some aha moments for also opportunities for greater engagement or greater research in a topic that I call operationalizing One Water. So we'll talk a little bit more about it. And for those of you who don't know, I'm also excited to share that I'm a current doctoral student with the UM under Dr. Esper as my advisor. So with that, before we get into it, I'd like to kind of put the lay of the land in terms of Miami-Dade, and I'll go very quick in some of these areas because these things can take up a lot of time. But 2.7 million residents and growing every day. We're a coastal community about 6.5 feet above sea level. We call ourselves a seagrass to a sawgrass, from the Everglades to the ocean and the bay, a seagrass to a sawgrass ecosystem. Nestled in between sanctuaries and national parks and water management areas, but most importantly, a very, very porous geology, which is very unique over here, the Biscayne Aquifer, a shallow limestone type of a topography, which poses its own challenges in terms of how water is managed or how water flows in this part of the region. Now, we are obviously connected with water on all sides. We've got the groundwater rise because of sea level rise. We see that on a nice sunny day, what happens in the coastal areas. We've got storm surges, hurricanes, and then, the stormwater side of it is managed through a very delicate ecosystem of primary, secondary, tertiary canals, managed by several stakeholders, ranging from the South Florida Water Management District all the way down to other stakeholders like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and of course, the local agencies here within Miami-Dade County. This is a very simple slide I just put in there, and we'll go more about it. But basically what this is depicting is you got aging infrastructure, which we all know. The seawalls are sometimes privately owned, publicly owned, but you also have saltwater intrusion that happens every time you have a sea level rise issue that we are talking about. So that is not something that is very new to Miami-Dade County. We have experienced, sea level rise since the 1870s, 12 inches since then, and then expected to continue to rise. And I'll share a slide from the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact that has done projections all the way beyond the year 2100. But the takeaway from this slide is that not only are we inundated with water from all sides, with all of the different shocks and stresses, and I'll introduce that term in a minute, but we are also ground zero from a standpoint of making sure that we are resilient from all of those perspectives. Now, in the previous role that I served, right now I serve in this capacity as the Director of One Water, which the mayor had appointed me into, and we'll talk more about what it means. But the previous role prior to this was to run a $7.8 billion infrastructure program for Miami-Dade Water and Sewer. It's one of the largest utility in southeastern United States, a system of about 94 production wells where we get our drinking water from. And three large water plants, three large wastewater plants, each totaling about 300 million gallons a day, with about 2,800 people working. But what's also more interesting is the 1,000+ pump stations that basically move wastewater through the entire county all the way to the treatment plant, and about 14,000 miles of combined water and wastewater pipes underground, right? So very complex, intricate system, as you can imagine. Now, from a standpoint of resiliency, these three wastewater plants are stone throws distance from the ocean, the north plant, the central plant, and the south plant. So from a coastal resiliency standpoint, in terms of being able to have those capacities up and running, obviously, that's a conversation that needs to be front and center. Climate change is here to stay, which is why we talk about sea level rise. The county has done a climate action strategy, a sea level rise strategy, and several such documents have been done dating back to our role with the Rockefeller Foundation and the 100 Resilient Cities. Now, just to take things a little bit more globally, everybody is talking about it, right? Florida is not unique in terms of just extreme precipitation and extreme rainfall. We're also talking about heat, and we're also have to be cognizant that climate change is and will be felt through the lens of water, whether it is in form of flooding, whether it's in the form of droughts, whether it's in the form of sea level rise or melting glaciers. Water connects that ecosystem as it relates to impact on the ground. Now, this slide over here that you'll see is a nice 300+ page report that I would recommend that if you can get your hands on it, it's a great read. It was a report done by the National Infrastructure Advisory Council. And the takeaway for me from this slide was how soon services in other service sectors start degrading. And the biggest ones were the hospital systems, and of course, your school and airport systems and emergency systems, ranging anywhere from 3 hours or even maybe 2 hours up to 8 hours, right? So the moment your water systems get degraded from a resiliency standpoint, either if it's impacted, let's say, due to any particular shock or stress, and we'll talk about a hurricane in our case here in Miami, or aging infrastructure for that matter, we have to start connecting the dots with other service sectors, which sadly sometimes we don't, because we tend to kind of look at resiliency in their own silos, and we really don't have all hands on deck when we start talking. And I had a case in Fort Lauderdale once where the raw water main to the plant was busted, and the hospital systems were kind of not aware about it, but the city was evacuating shopping malls and all these other places, right? And a friend of mine, a doctor friend, asked me, he says, I was in the surgery room and, all hell started breaking loose. And I asked him, I said, do you have a plan in hospitals? What happens if the water systems come down? And he was kind of blinks and stares. And I'm like, wow, we don't really take the time to really connect all the dots with infrastructure as it speaks. It could be airports, seaports, hospitals, and schools, right? So this is a 300-page report, but I think it's a great eye-opener there. Now, from a standpoint of Miami-Dade, as I said, we are in the inundation zone. If you take a look at those three wastewater plants, from a storm surge standpoint, we are in the inundation zone. The picture on the left shows, water flowing on the streets from the Miami River. This was in 2017 as a result of Hurricane Irma. Now, to further complicate the fact as it relates to shallow groundwater tables, the fact that we're looking at conveyance of waste, and the fact that there's an interaction between failing drain fields and water quality, impacts to groundwater because of the natural shallow topography that we have, you start looking at these density of septic tanks, primarily on the residential side, some on the commercial side. We've got over 100,000 septic tanks. The county has already initiated plans in motion to kind of start connecting these septic tanks back into the sewer system. The price tag on that was about $4.3 billion. So obviously getting that money into the system is a little complicated, because the way the bond ordinances are written today is we cannot use the current revenues to convert septics to sewer. So there's some grant monies coming in. Maybe there's some creative financing opportunities, could be triple P's, public-private partnerships. And there's also an ecosystem where, this conversation about, is a centralized system good enough for the future, or should we go back to some sort of a hybrid where you have a decentralized system? And I'll talk about it in terms of the pros and the cons. But clearly, we've got to start looking at making sure that these systems are also connected back into the sewers. Aging infrastructure, we all know about it. The American Society of Civil Engineers had given a grade a few years back. I think it was a D grade, then it became a C plus or a C minus. Clearly a failing grade, at least from an academic standpoint, or a sub failing grade, I would say. But obviously we are confronted with aging infrastructure from many, many years, and this is a huge challenge again which utilities have to face. Over here, in a very simplistic sense, I talked about it briefly, that as and when you have tidal fluctuations and you have sea level rise increasing, you're going to see the saltwater intrusion back through the catch basins because of the shallow topography that we experience. We've seen this in the form of sunny day flooding. On a nice sunny day, you'll see ankle deep water in our coastal communities. That affects way of life, that affects business, property values, and of course, even health and hygiene impacts. Every time you have these kind of scenarios, in addition to extreme precipitations, we also see the connectivities between water, in this case, salt water, entering into our wastewater systems. We don't have a combined sewer system here in Miami. So unfortunately, it functions like that because of the faults and the cracks in our sewer systems. Then salt water enters into our wastewater systems either through infiltration, which is through cracked pipes or infrastructure, or through inflow, which is from the manholes. And while all of this is being done, I would be remiss if I don't say that we're not doing enough. I think there's enough being done, clearly by the fact that $7.8 billion is being spent. But I'll also kind of paint that picture in terms of why that number probably is way higher from a futuristic standpoint. So we are looking at hardening standards. You're looking at some of the pictures where the new chlorine building design elevations are way elevated compared to where it was in the past. Concrete pads are being elevated. Miami Beach is raising streets. We're looking at living shorelines from a standpoint of dissipating the energy before it erodes, let's say, beaches and sand erosion, beach erosion, and things like that. So there's a lot of tools in the toolbox. The issue is all about integrating these tools and also scaling the implementation of it and understanding the true fiscal impact of the work that is needed in this part of the region. I talked about this part of it, so I'm going to quickly gloss over this. The good news is that we have a very sophisticated system in Miami-Dade that is all the time monitoring the impact to the saltwater intrusion into the and the potential impact to the 94 odd groundwater production wells from where we draw our drinking water supply from. This is a great partnership that the county has with the USGS. Now, the compact that came about, and some of you might know about more than a decade ago, a partnership between the four counties, was tasked with the work of building these, climate change projection curves. And they came up with the most recent unified climate change projections, which you see the ranges from, the inputs from IPCC, NOAA, and the range is anywhere from 2 feet all the way up to 10 feet. So depending on the risk and vulnerability of a specific asset that we are building, we have the ability to take the best use case in terms of what do we want to prepare in terms of the hardening standards when we get into the replacement or renewal of a specific asset. It could be a pump station, it could be a treatment plant, or it could be a buried underground asset. If it's close to the coastline, then obviously, we have to start looking at these projections. And so the compact has done a great amount of work, a lot of collateral on the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact website is also available if you're interested in diving deep into that. Now, from a standpoint of hardening guidelines, this is something that New York City DEP is doing. I think Miami-Dade is doing it to some extent. We do this when we get a hurricane, for instance. It could be from flood proofing or elevating equipment, or even installing backup powers or temporary sandbags. So we're doing quite a bit of that already. And I think these are all the tools in the toolbox on the wastewater side and the water side. On the water side, for example, one of our treatment plants is almost 100 years old. So, and I'll talk about it in one of the slides where I'll introduce some of the risks related to the water side of the equation as well. Another pictorial just to demonstrate how things are being designed and elevated from a futuristic standpoint. And one of the challenges it poses, if you just try to visualize all of the assets, the hundreds of assets behind the walls of a wastewater plant or a treatment or a water plant, harmonization of these assets becomes something that needs to be front and center. So as these incremental assets, individual discrete assets live their useful life, then the goal always is to start looking to harmonize these assets so that we are making sure that at any given point of time, we are able to navigate from one asset to the other asset, right? Otherwise, we would not be resilient again because some of these assets would then be underwater. Now, from a standpoint of the water side, we've got 450,000 accounts in Miami-Dade. We've got issues related to non-revenue water, and thankfully the county is now moving into this phase of what is known as the advanced metering infrastructure. That is, I think, going to go out to bid very soon. So very soon, in the next 5 or 6 years, we'll start looking at improvisation of this process. And the reason this is important is not just from an experiential standpoint, from a standpoint of a consumer that you're able to see your leaks and you're able to see pretty charts and tools on your phones. The reason it becomes important is in this conversation of affordability of water services and the conversation that the dollar can only be stretched so far. Governments and utilities and the private sector and academia and everybody who's connected to this has to start looking at it from a standpoint of how can we start making our systems more efficient. If we can reduce the non-revenue water, we are addressing the affordability gap, but we are also extending the service life of those dollars that are going to be saved to meet other unmet needs. We just can't be spending more and more money and then also having this tough conversation about equity and affordability of the services. So it's a very delicate balance that we have to tread. There's obviously a huge cost of investment here. It's about a $250 million investment over 5-6 years. So obviously the use case has to be made to say, well, if you're making a $250 million investment, what is the ROI, right? And that is something that's always there. Now, I want to take you a little bit out of Miami-Dade in terms of population growth over here, rising, fastest growing city in the country. Everybody wants to move here. Globally as well, we know that there's a population growth issue. Cybersecurity, the more we are becoming smart, utilities are taking this concept of what we call a smart utility, where more sensors, IoT systems are being incorporated, both on the water side, the wastewater side, and the stormwater side. So obviously, path of least resistance, the more of these happen, we become more and more vulnerable. Thankfully, from a treatment plant standpoint, again, within the Miami-Dade County ecosystem, I would say we are pretty secure, right? But we are only as secure as it takes the next intelligent hacker to do something. So we're always on the cutting edge, but we also have to be prepared and planned, running those risk scenarios all the time. Now, from a degradation standpoint, again, this is a little bit specific to Miami-Dade, where, we see these issues from seaweed and sargassum issues to red tide, algae blooms because of nutrient and fertilizers, pollution connected to the bay, but everything connected upstream of the bay as well. We've got, I think, hundreds of miles of primary, secondary, treated, tertiary canals that are impacted. So whenever you have extreme rainfall, you have runoff, you have pollutants that flow back into these canals, and then ultimately they go into the bay. As a result, of course, you have debris and litter that goes along with it, sometimes human-induced, sometimes just carries itself through the water. And an anoxic environment then results in fish kills. We've seen that in the news several times. Of course, you've got agricultural runoff that comes from the northern end of the county. And since it's a connected ecosystem, which is what I would like to share in terms of what One Water is, there's really no boundaries in terms of, who is impacting whose watershed. So how do you place those levels of accountability, and how do you start permitting those aspects so that, there's some level of knowledge or a method, I would say, in terms of cleanup actions or even responsibilities for the polluters wherever they might exist. Now, from a Biscayne Bay standpoint, for those who are from Miami, this is not news to you. We have seen in the news, there's several efforts being done, the Biscayne Bay Advisory Task Forces. There was a report that was built with 50-odd recommendations. But I would, also humbly submit that if you throw a bunch of dollars at the bay, and we have all the technologies in the world to, let's say, remediate the bay, the impact of the bay is only a matter of time where it'll get worsened again, because the ecosystem that is upstream of the bay, which is again the canal systems and the way we are permitting our existing structures, how are we preserving our green spaces, implementing green infrastructure within new developments, making sure that runoff is contained at source and treated at source so that it's not impacting the canal systems and ultimately the bay, right? So this is where that whole governance aspect of it comes in, on how stormwater is being governed, how is it being managed within Miami-Dade. Now, within Miami-Dade, just for the sake of making the conversation a little bit more complex, is we are a system of we are 34 cities in Miami-Dade County. So that's 34 different governance systems. At least for stormwater management by ordinance, it was designed to function as 34 different utilities, meaning actually, so you have 34 utilities with 34 rate structures, 34 decision-making points, 34 capital improvement projects. So you can imagine the complexity of the governance. And this is where I have been trying to push the envelope to say, well, we're not here to disrupt the existing ecosystem in terms of how the governance exists, but there is a whole lot of work that can be done behind the scenes in integrating the work of these 34 cities, both from a standpoint of maybe co-sharing on some of these projects, because then you're scaling the economies of scale, co-sharing on procurement efforts, so you're able to fast track the procurement, but also co-sharing on knowledge and models and decision-making that comes out of it, right? We don't have to do this independently, discreetly, multiple amounts of time. Again, saves the dollar, stretches those efficiencies to save those dollars to apply to other unmet needs. So this is kind of work in progress, and I'm hopeful that a lot will happen in the coming months and years on this front. We've seen the impacts of beach closures, whether it was due to fish kills or algae blooms. On the water side, I want to raise your attention really quick on this emerging contaminant called PFAS. It's called a forever chemical. It's a man-made chemical. It doesn't degrade naturally in the environment. Now it is having its impact on the water side, but down the road, we would probably talking about it still in the process of getting regulated. The lab methods for detecting this at the levels that the EPA has set up are still not perfected. But I'm pretty sure that maybe 2-3 years from now, we will be in the rulemaking for other emerging contaminants like microplastics. And maybe somewhere down the road, we will be talking about pharmaceuticals in water. Because of the scarcity in the system, and because we are getting limited supplies from our freshwaters, i.e. Biscayne Bay, at some point we would be having to resort to other systems, especially if we feel that climate change and sea level rise is here to stay. It's going to impact it's going to be impacting the well fields from the standpoint of saltwater intrusion. There will be a need to adapt to newer technologies. At least right now, we know it is with PFAS, but down the road, we need to plan and prepare. Again, that adds a burden in terms of not just the cost of treatment, but changing the treatment train and the entire process at these technologies that are currently implemented at the treatment plants. We have to be, having the fortitude and the foresight to do that. Now, in the middle of all of this, our jobs as technocrats or bureaucrats or academicians or even the industry, and then as consumers, we have this issue at the moment that unfortunately, even though water is such a big issue and wastewater is such a big issue, we take it for granted. And I think what we need to figure out is the why. What is it that we are not doing enough in communicating the impacts that we talk about it at our levels, taking it down to the granular level as far as the community is concerned, because we constantly complain about things that we take things for granted. So the global water stress is increasing. I said we take it for granted. In fortunate developed countries like ours, especially, we expect these things to happen. You turn on the faucet, you want a glass of clean water, you take a shower, you expect to have a nice warm shower, and you flush the toilet, you expect the waste to be carried away magically, right? None of these things we plan that they won't work, unless sadly in some of the underdeveloped countries, it's a way of life. I had the fortune to working with folks in Cape Town. They were ground zero, there were riots there. professionals like us, I was told, were being diagnosed with PTSD post riots. They were ground zero. And same thing is in Australia: droughts, livestock dying, or right under the eyes of the farmers. Chennai in India, major issues, and still a major issue. If you look at it in Europe, that's whether it's in Germany or Norway or England, we've got issues there. North America, of course, right here in Miami, we see nice sunny day floodings. And of course, when we have extreme precipitations, Chile has some issues in terms of a South American country, but there's several others that I can name. So at the end of the day, when we look at it as a freshwater resource, less than 1% of fresh water on this planet is available for all it's a 7 billion, it's 8 billion people on planet Earth. So the reason I bring this up is just to elevate this conversation a little bit more, to kind of think out the box. And that conversation is one of national security. It might sound a little way out of the box at the moment, but if you look at the United States, we've got the Homestead Air Force Base that we service, but the US has military bases all across the country, but all across the world. And the last thing that you want is those countries are suffering or having a crisis as it relates to any one of these ecosystems, mostly water and sanitation, because then it starts impacting the security of those countries. But if the pandemic has always taught us something, is we live in this global supply chain ecosystem, whether it was face masks or whether it was toilet paper. We are reliant on countries where water becomes the backbone of every other service sector, as we saw in that first few slides from the National Infrastructure Advisory Council, right? So this is, again, just to drive the point home. I'm not going to read it, but both from a water and sanitation standpoint, we're talking about not a few 100,000. We're talking about millions and billions of people that are being impacted today as we talk about sanitation. Now, when you take it to agricultural systems, these numbers that you see might be varying depending on which publications you review. But the point I wanted to make here is the amount of water it takes to produce these agricultural elements: almonds, avocado, sugarcane, rice, bananas, and this concept of virtual water that becomes more prevalent is when you start talking about sustainability and you start talking about the total amount of water that goes into the production of a kilogram of avocado. It says about 2,000 liters, right? It starts driving that point home. Maybe there will be a point in time somewhere. It's an aspirational thought for me, just like you have nutritional labels. Maybe there's a point in time where products from a manufacturing standpoint will start thinking about labeling these concepts of what virtual water is. How much water went into the production of a certain aspect of a product? So it makes consumers conscious about behavioral modifications. I want to bring this out again from a standpoint of farming and agriculture, whether it is pollination and the number of crops that thrive on pollination, again, due to impact of climate change or due to water, but also the production of livestock, right? Whether it's chicken, pork, or steak, 1,800 gallons for 1 pound of steak. So next, think about it. I'm not asking you to become vegetarians, but I think it kind of drives the point home. Now, the reason I brought those slides out are not just to talk about the water and energy nexus. We talk about it ad nauseum. We've got cogen facilities at our wastewater treatment plant. We are harvesting biogas. We are converting methane to cogen, about 2 megawatts. I think it has a capacity up to 8 megawatts. We've got a landfill next to our wastewater treatment plant in Virginia Key. We're talking about taking the methane from the landfill and also, cleaning it up and then, mining that gas into converting into electricity or energy, right? To become energy neutral. We're talking about energy neutrality, but we don't really connect the dots very well in terms of water, energy, and then food or agricultural systems. And we probably don't do a very good job about connecting it to water, energy, food, and the health ecosystem. And to me, I think there's a whole lot of correlation that needs to be made. And hopefully the world of data and AI will start playing a bigger impact. But hopefully this is also some aha moments from some research standpoint. And a case in point here is, hospital room admissions due to, let's say, gastrointestinal impacts. How did it connect to, let's say, a food product or an agriculture product that somebody consumed in that particular day? Are we really connecting it to water? Are we really connecting it to food, right? We don't make those correlations, so therefore we don't know the impact. But I think the interesting point here would be that if you implement systems at source to manage water and sanitation, what did it do downstream of it in impacting human health, so that we save those dollars again from a standpoint of human health management, and be able to divert those dollars into some other unmet needs, whether it's in the communities or whether it is research and development. At the end of the day, I think we are connected 70%. The body is 70% water. And then from a sanitation standpoint, same concepts again. Thankfully, we don't have the issues of open defecation. But for those of you who have traveled around the world, I'm sure you've seen it. I have seen it. I've experienced it. I've been impacted from a health standpoint because of that. So I'm very sensitive to these issues when it comes down to sanitation issues in developing countries. And the quality of water and the impact of water because of all of these issues is a huge challenge. Waste has been found at the foothills of the Everest. And obviously defecation is a big issue in impoverished countries. So what are the strategies? What are the solutions, right? So this is where this concept of one water comes in. In nature, the ecosystem of water from a water cycle that we all learned in grade school happens day in and day out without any problem. We see this happening, and we all know what the water cycle is all about. So I won't delve a whole lot of it. But what has happened in practice is the natural water cycle is obviously it's been impacted due to all of these other systems that come into play, right? And here you see some of these systems, whether they are septic tanks, dealing with industrial waste, water that gets diverted to agricultural systems, so the water supply system in terms of runoff, for instance, within Miami-Dade, when I said 34 cities, it doesn't behave in a manner where it goes as a boundary within 34 cities. It follows the path of least resistance, right? So in the context of that, I think the conversation that becomes super critical is, what is the watershed, right? How do we define what a watershed is? And let's think of Miami-Dade. If it's 34 cities, what is the watershed? And then in the context of a watershed, what does resiliency really mean? Are we keep saying we need to be resilient? What does that mean, right? So is it an ecological boundary or is it an administrative boundary, right? Political or ecological? And while we do all of the work that I said, 7.8 billion, if we don't manage our stormwater systems correctly, they find their way back into our wastewater systems, driving the CapEx and the OpEx. Obviously, equity and affordability becomes an issue. When you look at it from a catchment standpoint, we were fortunate to work with the Rockefeller Foundation, with Arup as a consulting partners. And within this system, you'll see that there are a bunch of things that happen from an asset standpoint, from a demand management standpoint, planning and urban design, green infrastructure, rivers and waterways. It's a very complicated ecosystem. And we started mapping it. We started saying, okay, all the way from abstracting the water from the ground, treating it, supplying it, managing it, regulating it, and the users from Turkey Point and the nuclear plant. We started mapping it, and it became, a living cobweb. It was so difficult. And you see those little icons on the top. Those are the stakeholders that manage water one way or the other. So when we mapped it out, we said, okay, let's see if we can put some method to this madness. And we started looking at the different services, as you see, wastewater, water, flood risk, rivers and waterways, environment and energy. And if you look at it from a planning level standpoint, a service level, or a regulation standpoint, those dots show how many different agencies and stakeholders have their hands in each of those processes, all for good reasons. But the question I think that begs attention is, as these shocks and stresses are becoming more and more clear to us, have we taken the time to go back and really improve the way we've managed, regulated, or permitted or implemented these systems? Maybe not, right? Because we keep building more and more regulations, but we don't sit down and improve these processes. So the complexity of the work sometimes becomes inundating, right? And we did this work with several countries around the world with the Rockefeller. And there were 1,500 indicators which started, like, how do you really start measuring resiliency? As of today, there is no method in terms of an indicator to measure resiliency. So we brought it down into some dimensions, goals, and 57 indicators that kind of whittle down from 1,500 indicators. And in the context of resiliency, I think the conversation that definition that drives home to me is always this concept of shocks and stresses. A shock that happens immediately, like you see a hurricane, and a stress is something that happens over a period of time, aging infrastructure, population growth, and so on. And I'm going to gloss over this quickly because of time, but it could be achieved through design or use of data or energy sources, improving regulations, reducing carbon footprint. But they're all again a siloed approach. If you have done some good work in any one of these domains, you're only going to be as resilient as the weakest link in the resiliency chain. So we really cannot afford to have what I call pockets of excellence, right? I'd rather be satisfactory in all of those domains rather than doing an amazing job in managing my assets, but not doing an amazing job in, let's say, using data to bring all of our stakeholders together. So these were some definitions you'll see, again, not a standardized definition that we can adopt. There's one from the EPA, there's one from the US government. My favorite is the one from the US, from the 100 Resilient Cities, because it talks about adaptability to this concept of shocks and stresses. And this is where I introduce the term One Water. And I know I'm doing it almost to the tail end of the presentation for a reason. The US Water Alliance has done amazing amount of work. And the goal that One Water looks at it is from this whole integrated lens of a watershed. And you see those domains over there, those 6 domains, everything falls under those domains. Amazing amount of work that has been done by the Alliance. There's publications behind it, but you will see that it is all about thriving cities, businesses, agricultural systems, social and economic inclusion, of course, healthy waterways from a recreational standpoint and an economic standpoint as well. So basically what we've learned, at least from my experience over here, there's a lot more, is we can't ignore our assets. Our assets have to be programmed based on risk, because we don't have the funding to just say that we'll start doing everything at the same time, right? So we have to characterize the risks profile of these assets and create, a 20-year plan, a 5-year plan that drives the 1-year plan. We also learned that data is coming to us at a fast and furious pace. It's going to come to us at even more of a furious pace. Sadly, I think the utilities are still in the infancy journey in terms of making the most. I think the health and the insurance and the banking industry have done a lot of work. I think there's a lot more opportunities for utilities to exploit the data. And the reason I say that is, if you see the slides, if you see those round circles, these are the various sporadic sources of data that we have in utilities, from asset management and SCADA and hydraulic models and closed circuit TVs and risk-based models. But the decision-making has to be in an integrated fashion, which we're doing to some extent. In my opinion, I think there's a lot more to be done so that we integrate this data into one ecosystem, and then we drive the decision-making that you see on the right side of the slide. And it, of course, has to be reliable, insightful, and actionable. Now, the concepts of waste becomes critical. We used to talk about cradle to cradle. We are now talking, we're talking about cradle to grave, but now we are talking about cradle to cradle. This concept of circular economies. In the concept of a wastewater treatment plant, for instance, we're talking about biosolids, but we are also being confronted with a challenge that biosolids now might have PFAS, because we never were regulating PFAS in biosolids. So can we use biosolids for composting? Maybe not. So unfortunately, it has to go to a landfill. So this is, again, work in progress. But the opportunity is to extract all of the intrinsic energy in a wastewater system, whether it is nutrients and fertilizers, or whether it's energy, or whether, as I said, it is biosolids, right? So we're very familiar with the reduce, reuse, and renew. I like to throw in the 4th R, which is recover, right? To the extent we need to be recovering everything, even from our wastewater systems, is a huge opportunity, which is being done in some developed utilities around the world. Singapore is one of them, but I think in the US, it gives us a lot of opportunities. For those who are very familiar with LEED for buildings, I just wanted to put this out there, if that's of interest to you. emission rating system. Utilities can use them. It was developed in collaboration with APWA and Harvard and two other institutes, but it's the emission rating system, which is a very nice system, spans over, I think, 60 plus credits. But the goal here is to provide this, I like to say, the triple value proposition, which is the social, economic, and the environmental benefits as well, beyond just the immediate benefit of a project if you're replacing an asset, right? So the lessons we learned, obviously, was we cannot be operating in a bubble. We need to make sure that we align ourselves with not just local insights and, let's say, the compact that did an amazing job, but also nationally and internationally. So we are, not learning, we steepen the learning curve, but we also operationalize things that are happening beyond us. And we've done an amazing work in the county here, and more is happening every day. And you see how we have aligned ourselves over here with national associations, global associations, but also regionally, how are we aligning ourselves with other departments, the strategic plans that the mayor had implemented recently, the Thrive 305, the climate action, the sea level rise strategies. They all are intended to basically assist us in connecting the dots between infrastructure on various domains and as it relates to resiliency. And as I said, the triple bottom line concept is so critical. I think there's a lot more to be done on this part of it. And the takeaway for me here is when we, let's say we cost out our projects, we typically look at it from a labor standpoint, equipment and material standpoint. But we don't look at it from a standpoint of saying, well, what's the ROI? The ROI is also quantifiable, but we struggle with quantifying the ROI in terms of the social, economic, and environmental benefits proactively. And the reason I bring that out is if our total, cost impact in the county is $1 billion on an annual basis, and out of the $1 billion, we get bonded for maybe $600 or $650 million on the water and sewer side. If we are able to prioritize projects in terms of that triple bottom line, which is the social, economic, environmental benefits, as a separate column, then all of a sudden, maybe the prioritization aspect becomes a little different from just labor, equipment, and materials. So this is an opportunity. This is something that is near and dear to me, and I'd like to see more of it happening, not just in Miami-Dade, but other governmental institutions as well. And end of the day, I think it's all about putting our systems aligned so that, some of the attributes that I came up with, just this was for me to make sure that when I talk to my teams, I'm questioning myself, but I'm also questioning the accountability of our teams towards the work that we do when we are entrusted with, millions and billions of dollars to spend. And I would say that from a journey standpoint, we'll never be able to say that we are fully resilient, but we are on that journey. And, the number one is when we are fully aligned. But I would say we are somewhere between 2 and 3, that we are constantly being nimble, agile, looking at those shocks and stresses, and trying to be positioning ourselves ahead of them rather than being, reactive and playing catch up to any shock or stress that we might face. The takeaway, obviously, is that it's a continuing improvement cycle. We will constantly learn and we will constantly improve, right? But we also need to make sure that we build an index behind it so we can benchmark ourselves against the best of the best, and also ensure that we are placing that accountability to the communities we serve to say, if we're spending $5 billion in the last 7 years, well, how resilient are we today compared to, let's say, 7 years ago? Or how resilient will we be 15 years from now compared to 10 years ago, right? So 3 large action items that came out is, one, we've got to do a better job in ensuring that we are able to have conversations around an integrated data portal so that when engineers and planners and academicians and research and development that is being done has to be across one set of data. To me, if there's one unifying language that we can speak outside of our technical domains, I think that would be data. And if we are able to get, put ourselves in front of it and put some systems behind it, then I think it will be a huge win in the utility business. Second is making sure that we are preparing ourselves for the future in terms of this interdisciplinary learning, which becomes extremely critical. right? Engineers, civil engineers need to start looking and learning more about data systems and vice versa, so that we are not learning on the job, right? We need to start looking at policies. We need to start looking at communications. As technocrats, we need to convey these hard conversations to elected officials and policymakers and even members of the community. So I feel that this whole knowledge platform of learning from an interdisciplinary approach is needed. And we're doing some work in it, but a lot more hands need to unite to do much bigger, better jobs out of it. And then the last is this cross-sectoral collaborations between various functional groups, including the nonprofits. So if we are transparent about our needs, if data is driving the research, then obviously the academic community knows much better in terms of where their priorities could be, right? And they could be aligned to do all of the research, as well as our master students can do some of their thesis aligned with the work that we are facing. And hopefully some of them became apparent from today's talk over here. And lastly, I would say that local actions are critical, but we have to align our actions with global goals, right? And to me, that global goal is the United Nations SDGs. And it's just opportune because after 46 years, the United Nations conference is happening this month in New York. And for the first time after 46 years, the topic is on water, right? So stay tuned to the work that is coming out of the UN as well. Some major thought leadership that will come out of the UN conference this month. And that should conclude it. And I hope I was on time, 2 minutes beyond, but thank you for your patience.